Okay, I am. We are back on the record for number session number 3, um, and in no particular order. I wanted to pick up a little bit where we left off. Some of the concepts or things that we talked about last time, and that is, yeah, I have heard. I mean, people have told me that basically music law, the entertainment law industry didn't exist until Jay Cooper.
That's not true.
I'm just saying this is stuff that people have said to me in the past. So that's why I want to ask about it, though. When you got into, in the early 1950s and the mid 50s, when you were practicing music law, I think this was during the era we talked about of like 78s, so that may not be vinyl, but that was kind of a new technology.
No, there were vinyls when I started practicing. When I started.
Actually, you did say that. There were vinyls when you started practicing,
Yeah.
but it was still the early portion of the industry.
There was still vinyl. There was 78s and 45s.
So how did this, this was before your time when sheet music, essentially, even before mechanical and piano rolls existed, sheet music was prevalent, and sheet music,
Right.
they would pay royalties on sheet music, and that seems what kind of the birth of music publishing. Is that right?
Right, yeah, that's where it came out of. Probably mostly, probably mostly New York, because this occurred in the early 1900s, uh, when in order to uh, get music on radio and all that, they started selling sheet music in stores, and the hopes that the people would buy it and then listen to the radio to hear the music.
So, given that it was just sheet music and given that there was radio, was it just the situation that before recorded music, that live, musicians, whatever, would play music on the radio based on the sheet
They
music?
were in dance halls and in dance halls and weddings and at bar mitzvahs and Polish weddings and whatever. Yeah.
So sheet music was king at this time, and there was publishing, but there were no recorded versions of music at this stage.
Well, they were recording in the 20s. They were recording 20s. I think there was a lot more recordings than done in the 30s, but there were some recordings done in late 20s. To my knowledge, I don't know. I was born in 29.
So the sheet music, basically, after a while, it gave way, but mechanical versions of it, like the piano rolls, and eventually the 78s came into being, and then, of course, vinyl records, 45s, 33s. You mentioned were around when you started practicing. So in those early days, how was the royalty structure between the publishing side, be it sheet music, and the recorded version side? How did that come to be where there's two separate copyrights, one for sheet music, one for the composition and one for the recorded version
That's
of the
what the
composition?
Copyright Act was the copyright. Our major copyright, the first was 1909, and I don't know. I've never read the 1909 that was done in 1909. But by the time I started practicing law, the 1909 Copyright Act provided for a royalty for sheet music and a royalty for recordings.
So that was already in place by the time you were practicing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And then that remained, through the vinyl era. Did anything change, like when CDs came into?
Big time when CDs came in.
Okay,
CDs
so
came
what were those changes?
Around 1980, CDs came in. So what people read out and did was, because it was so convenient, the CD, you didn't have to turn it over, because 78s and 33s for that matter, you would turn, 45s, you would turn them over, and there'd be something on the other side, and more tracks on the other side. So when CDs came in, which was early 80s, somewhere around between 80 and 82, what happened was that people ran out and replenished their recording library of 78s and 33s with CDs. And so, what do you call it? Vinyl albums were selling probably for $8-9 an album, and now the same album comes out on CD, and it was selling for $15, $16, $17, $18, but it was the same product.
Was it more, I don't know if you know this, but was it more expensive or less expensive to manufacture than vinyls and distribute?
Well, I'm not positive. I would guess it would be probably. I don't know the answer to that.
But as a music industry lawyer at that time, did you lobby for greater, better, higher royalties for your clients?
Well, we started to ask for higher royalties because they were getting $5 more for the same product. They were getting $5 more for the same product.
And that's why I'm asking if it was more expensive to manufacture. Were they claiming it was more expensive?
Oh, I think they claimed that a little bit, but it wasn't that. It couldn't have been that much more.
And they nevertheless kept breakage in the contracts.
Yeah.
So was that a boon to the music industry? Is what you're saying in terms of revenue?
Oh yeah. It's a gigantic boon to the
because people were replacing vinyl, or because they were charging more?
Both.
And so the music industry had a period of
it was a major explosion on purchases, amount of product being sold, and income being earned from the labels.
And did that translate into more money for the songwriters and the recording artists?
Songwriters got the same money. So remember, whatever it was at that time, I don't think it was 9.1 cents, but it was, I don't remember what it was, 7 or...
Whatever the statutory rate was.
Whatever the statutory rate was. No, the statutory rate remained the same, whether it was a vinyl record or whether it was a, what do you call it, a 33, I mean, whether it was a 33 or 78, the per track royalty was still the same for compositions.
Now, for the recording artists, though, did they see more money as a result of this?
Oh, only after a whole bunch of us started fighting for higher royalties.
And how did you go about doing that?
Well, and for certain, any new deal that came up, we went in for higher royalties.
So this was negotiated on a case-by-case basis, basically.
Correct.
What about, though, was the Copyright Royalty Board in place at that time? Did they eventually raise the rate to 9.1 cents? How did that happen?
I don't remember exactly. Well, we'll have to take a look at the Copyright Act at the time. I think there was I can't remember whether it was done in Congress or done by the Copyright Royalty Board. I can't remember.
Who were artists coming to you at this point saying we want more money because of this, or were you recommending it to your clients back then?
I don't know. It's probably a combination of both.
And what about at this point, though, in the early 50s, were they able to make money off of touring?
Yeah. They weren't playing the gigantic venues they play today, but they were doing a lot more touring.
Now, tied to this was radio airplay, and as we know, I mean, ASCAP BMI pays composers for the public performance royalties, but radio never did. Radio never has.
That's not true.
Well, when did they pay performance royalties to the artists?
Not to the artists.
That's what I'm talking about.
They paid to the songwriters.
No, ASCAP and BMI, they get paid.
They still don't pay. They still do not pay to the musicians.
Exactly. So my question is, since publishers were receiving royalties via the performing rights organizations for the compositions, when music was being played on the radio back then, radio has always justified it as, quote, promotion, unquote. But what did people try to change that in those early days? And not only in the early days, I'm guessing, have continued to fight to try to change that to this day. So I'd like to understand a little bit more if the sole philosophy is I guess because the radio lobbies are. We talked about, I'm butchering this, but we talk about, for example, there are radio stations in every county in the country.
Correct.
So in the middle of Iowa, they don't have a music industry out there, so
Correct.
that makes the radio, it's not lobby, but whatever, the radio industry more powerful than the music industry.
Yes.
And what efforts have you seen over the years, in the last 70 years, to change that? And are you getting closer?
Many. I mean, Sound Exchange, right here that I'm wearing. Sound Exchange has been, amongst others, there's others, been advocating for a royalty. The radio pay royalties to the performers for years. For years, it's been going on, this battle. But what the radio has a very strong lobby. They run into every new Congress and they get them to sign an intent not to have any royalty paid to musicians, because radio is doing promotion and radio is suffering terribly. And my argument is, radio plays music to get an audience. An audience gets them ratings. Ratings get them sponsors, and sponsors give them dollars. That's why they play music. If music wasn't working, if they didn't have an audience, they'd go to talk radio, which a lot of them did. But they keep saying, well, we're doing promotion. To a degree, at a period of time, that's true, because all the labels used to hire indie promotion people to go to lobby radio stations by giving them
payola.
Payola, right. There's been cases on that subject. Payola to play music. Why do they do that? Because it was a major promotion thing. But they wouldn't play the music if they would switch to talk radio if they didn't have an audience.
Do you mean, I want to ask about Sound Exchange in a minute, but given that, for example, when I was working at Geffen Records, I helped out a lot in the promotion department, and we would send product promotional giveaways to the radio stations to get them to play it. And the radio stations were playing it, but the promotion department seemed to rely upon that in order to generate sales, be it singles, but preferably albums. So have the record companies gone along with that concept?
They went along with it for a long time. The world is different now. Radio does not have that much of an effect on promotion, because it's all these other internet services and things like that, where the young people who buy a lot of records listen to.
Yeah, I'm going to cover that, but you said it was like, when did Sound Exchange start?
Sound Exchange has been in existence around 20 years, I think.
Right, so that's really late in the game. That's around 2000. That's
correct.
By the time they got it, with the advent of digital distribution, streaming, digital download.
It's also in the Copyright Act.
Sound Exchange
was created by the Copyright Act. Section
and what was your role in it?
Well, I was. It was formed about 2 or 3 years. It was formed by by RIAA originally, and then spun off. And I was on the original board once it was spun off. So,
how did you end up on the board?
I don't remember.
When you were on the board,
I'm
though,
still on the board.
What was okay? But I mean, at this point, when you were added to the board, this was before it was written into law, or
before what?
Before Sound Exchange was written into the Copyright Act.
No. Sound Exchange was born in the Copyright Act. Born in Section 115.
Section 115 of the Copyright Act.
Yeah.
But was the board formed before it was added to Section 115?
No.
So legislators added Section 115, and Sound Exchange came out of that.
Correct.
And after it was formed, somebody asked you to be on the board of directors?
Yeah. The RIAA lobbied for Section 115 because we have all these new technologies and what have you. And now you have a digital radio, interactive and non-interactive. And so the RIA went in there and said, so I can't tell you who exactly, but in 115 they talk about an entity to be formed to collect these royalties from internet sources. Sound Exchange collects non-interactive performances from digital.
Non-interactive, like Pandora.
Yes. Interactive, although we were collecting interactive at the beginning, our record companies decided to take it for themselves because they were entitled to. Because our only mandate is non-interactive digital performances.
So it took, all those years. That's, if we talked about going back to the 20s when recorded music started emerging, it took 80 years to get Sound Exchange.
No, not true. There was no internet.
No. I understand that. But you said it wasn't really until Sound Exchange came along until something was finally done about getting performance royalties for the actual performers, the artists. So in the 80 years from 1920s to the year 2000, what other efforts are you aware of were there to get actual performers actual performance royalties?
There were several cases. I think Fred Waring had a case. This was in the 20s or the 30s. Suing. Those are important cases. I don't remember the details of them, but I think Fred Waring was one of them. A very important case where he was trying to get royalties from radio for the performance of his music on discs. Okay, I think he lost that case. There were a couple cases like that, and then there was some action that was done by Sinatra and other people who formed a group of people to go after sound recordings, and they kept losing in the courts.
What were they kept on losing? What were they arguing justified the royalties for?
That the radio had no right to perform the recordings without paying the performers.
And is that at all? Because, well, it wouldn't be based on the fact that the sound recordings have a separate copyright in the Copyright Act, because the performers don't own the recording itself. But so when they're going in to say, "Hey, that's my performance on the radio," what legal standard were they relying upon? They kept losing, so it sounds like there wasn't one.
They kept losing. But I can't. I'm not speaking with authority on those cases. I haven't read those cases in 30 years or more, so I don't remember. I do know that there was cases involving, I think, Paul Whiteman, Fred Waring, etc., in which they were going after these things because the recordings used to have when they were sold, they used to have a thing on it for home use only or something to that effect. There was actually a thing on the label. It said for home use only, for personal use or something of that nature. And on the basis of that, that's why they sued. That's best of my recollection, which can be checked easily enough.
Okay. And so Sound Exchange came into being.
Came in as a result of a congressional act that was lobbied by essentially the RIAA. They were doing it for themselves. They weren't doing it so much for the artists. But eventually, whatever happened, and I didn't partake in that. I wasn't active in that. the royalties were divided. Sound exchange royalties were divided between record companies, the artists, and the background singers and musicians.
You, the Recording Academy, they have their Grammys on the Hill and stuff. Did the Recording Academy during that era, were they attempting to lobby Congress and to get some legislation to get performers paid?
I believe so.
Did you ever do that when you were president? Or?
Yeah, I did it. I went to Congress a number of times with a whole group, and we walked the halls and went to various senators and congressmen's offices. Yeah.
Was this when you were president, or is this more recently during the Grammy?
When I was president and after.
And what sort of reception did you receive?
A polite reception, but get lost.
Was that true even of the congressmen from the Los Angeles and New York area that understood the business?
No, I think Howard Berman from L.A. and I forget who in New York were very receptive.
But in the minority.
In the minority.
For the reasons we talked about. So then, before Sound Exchange, you think it's around 20 years old. This was also, now my recollection anyway, that even before streaming and before digital downloads was Napster. And
was what?
Napster.
Napster was the beginning of streaming. That was
that was peer-to-peer sharing, but it was digitally sharing files.
Yeah, but that was the beginning of it. That came in around the year 2000, somewhere around 2000, 2001.
I thought it was 1999 for Napster, but...
Okay, so 1999 or 2000, somewhere in that vicinity.
So, that, at the time, my recollection of it was pretty disruptive to the music industry.
Well, destructive because it replaced... Goodbye, Dee.
I can't be here.
Huh? No. Well, you can sit here quietly if you want.
I'll sit here quietly.
And if you open up your mouth, I'm going to dismiss you.
You're going to have to...
Dismiss you.
Dismiss you.
I'm going to go to the bathroom first.
So you're dismissing yourself.
Basically, the CD explosion that occurred in the early 80s was wiped out when Napster came in 1999, 2000.
And that was because of the peer-to-peer sharing.
Yeah.
One person would buy the CD, put it on MP3, and share it with scores, dozens, hundreds of their closest friends.
Correct.
And the RIAA, I remember going after people to shut it down. Were you involved in that?
No.
Well,
they wound up suing a couple grandmothers, which gave them really bad publicity.
But I remember you telling the story, actually. People had asked you, why would they sue a little old, grandmother in Ohio, and she didn't know that it was illegal, and your answer was, she does now.
Right.
Did you subscribe to that theory of suing these people for the publicity? I mean, I guess what was the negative publicity outweigh the publicity or the awareness portion of the publicity that it's illegal?
Yeah, well, they didn't have a choice at that time. I don't think they had a choice. It was a runaway train, and so they had to do something. It's unfortunate a few grandmothers got caught, but I don't think they had a choice. They had to stop this thing, otherwise there'd be no music industry.
So why do you think that... First of all, did you take any independent efforts on behalf of artists to do anything, or was that solely the RIAA?
The RIAA was running the show.
Why do you think that the music industry as a whole, because it destroyed the revenues, it went from some $40 billion in revenues down to $15 billion in revenue as a result of the pirating,
yes.
It's still pirating as a result of the peer-to-peer sharing, which I consider different from pirating, like bootlegs. But that was a major impact. Why do you think that the music industry was unprepared for this or didn't see it coming?
I have no idea. I mean, I wasn't on the front lines of that part of it, and the peer-to-peer sharing, I don't know. It caught the industry totally by surprise.
What is your best recollection? Like, I know the RIA went after suing these people, and I think eventually sued Napster and eventually settled with Napster. So, first of all, did you have any involvement in any of that?
No.
What is your best recollection that happened? I mean, with the Napster settlement and the aftermath of that?
Watching what was happening, because our clients' income was at stake.
Did you personally witness your client's income suffer significantly?
Well, the answer is, yeah. There was a big drop off. There was a big drop off generally.
So, what can you tell me, if anything, about the RIAA versus Napster lawsuit, the settlement, and how ultimately it was resolved?
Well, ultimately, the RIA won those cases, and eventually, those companies, most of them, decided to go legit and started entering into deals with the RIA to pay the record company and artists.
And
remember, what they were doing was doing it not on behalf of the label themselves, but on behalf of the label and the artist, ultimately, because any settlement that they made or any royalties they collected, a portion of that would go to the artist. So they were doing it so the artists benefited by the actions that the labels were taking, or the RIA was taking.
And then iTunes came into being effectively in the wake of this.
Right.
And others, I guess, similar to iTunes, when you talked about them going legal. I mean, iTunes wasn't doing it. iTunes seems to have seen an opportunity because of the Napster settlement, to legally sell music.
Correct.
And they jumped in there. And originally, or for a long time, iTunes was the biggest retailer.
Yeah, but they were doing downloads.
And downloads started to surpass, and eventually did surpass, CD sales.
Well, I don't know if it actually surpassed CD sales or not, but it certainly became a major force.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things when I studied it, when I wrote that article on it, was the chart when, I forgot what year it was, but when downloads blew past at one point in time CDs, and then enter streaming, which has transitioned things again, because something that I've talked about, where streaming, kids prefer access over ownership. They like streaming, the ability to not own physical product, but to have access to it on their phones, whatever devices, anywhere in the world. But so in going from that transition to from vinyl into eventually digital distribution into streaming, or vinyl to CDs to digital distribution to streaming, how have you seen? What are the significant legal changes that you've seen as a result of that, or industry changes as a result of that?
Well, the income has gotten back up to where it was before Napster. Okay.
The income present day is
gross income, right? So while it was around a $40 billion business worldwide before Napster, I think it's back. Although I haven't looked at the figures, but I understand it's back up in those numbers, or maybe higher.
And is that, I don't know that Spotify's changed its rates, but like its streaming rates and stuff is still a fraction of a penny per stream.
Everything's a fraction of a penny, but the fractions are amazing.
Because the number of streams is amazing. Where Gold Records, when did Gold Records actually come into, become a thing?
I'm not sure.
Were they